Right now, Chevy dealers are slashing prices by tens of thousands of dollars, with some discounts hitting $32,000 per vehicle. This isn't a sale, it's a survival move. But the real question is, who triggered this price collapse and how far will it go? The day production went off the rails. Production days usually follow predictable rhythms inside a major automaker, but the morning everything slipped felt different the moment I stepped onto the scheduling floor. Screens that normally displayed smooth, steady output lines showed an unmistakable spike, an upward curve that made seasoned engineers stare in silence. Our forecasting algorithm, the model built to balance demand and capacity, had projected a surge that no one in the building expected. At first, people assumed it was a temporary glitch, the kind of misread that resolves after a recalibration cycle. Then, the validation script confirmed the same number 3 times in a row. That was when the tension settled across the room like static. You could feel the shift when managers realized the system had authorized production levels far above the threshold we usually guard. Robots kept moving, conveyors kept feeding, and no one wanted to be the person who pulled the emergency stop on a process that large. The algorithm insisted the market wanted significantly more units, and the plant obeyed, because that is what plants do. By midday, excess frames were already stacking at the end of the line. The curve had been wrong, and every minute we hesitated made the mistake harder to unwind. But awareness arrived too late, and the output surge became the first domino in a chain that no one was prepared to face. It was irreversible, but miscalculations inside one department were only the beginning. The real unraveling started when the data reached the strategy teams, when the numbers stopped making sense. Inside the strategy wing, the confusion began with a single spreadsheet that refused to match the projections we had trusted for years. Demand curves that once moved with the predictability of aviation charts suddenly dipped, rose, and twisted in ways no analyst could justify. It felt like watching a flight instrument flicker during turbulence, the kind of malfunction that leads to cascading failures if the crew misinterprets what they see. Our models relied on consumer behavior patterns gathered over a decade, yet those patterns no longer aligned with the economic signals arriving from dealerships across multiple regions. Interest rates had shifted, competition had intensified, and shoppers were leaning toward brands that had adapted faster to changing expectations. But our forecasting engine kept insisting the opposite, treating outdated assumptions as if they were still reliable. Meetings stretched for hours, while teams debated whether the anomaly came from corrupted data or a structural blind spot baked into the algorithm itself. Every line we checked created 2 new contradictions. The more we studied the forecasts, the more the numbers resembled a mirage rather than a meaningful prediction. By the time leadership requested a full audit, the orders tied to those projections had already been released to the plants. And once production starts at scale, reversing the flow is almost impossible. The numbers had stopped making sense, yet the machine kept moving, setting the stage. But the consequences of bad math were nothing compared to what happened once those vehicles had to be physically moved. If you are following how quickly this situation is accelerating, make sure you like the video, subscribe for the next updates, and tell me your reaction below. The logistics system began to choke. The first signs of logistical strain appeared when our transport lanes slowed without warning. Trucks that normally cycled through the yard with mechanical consistency began queuing along the perimeter, forming lines so long that drivers joked about needing lunch deliveries. As the fleet logistics manager, I knew delays usually meant weather disruptions or supplier setbacks, but this time the cause was simply volume. Finished vehicles were emerging from the plants faster than we could move them, and storage lots that once felt endless were filling at a pace none of us anticipated. We rented additional land parcels, marked them with temporary fencing, and watched them disappear under rows of unsold units within days. Satellite images confirmed what our teams already sensed. The system was choking. Transport networks can absorb fluctuations, but a sustained surge overwhelms even the best coordinated routes. Carriers asked for rate adjustments, some even declined loads, and the gridlock spread outward from the distribution hub like a ripple across water. Every outbound lane carried the same burden, yet the incoming flow never slowed. You do not realize how much land cars consume until you have run out of it. And by then the options become narrow. The pressure kept building, forcing decisions that would soon reach the executive level and ignite the next stage of the crisis. It was the moment the system revealed its deepest vulnerabilities fully. Those vulnerabilities soon reached the only place left to absorb them, the executive tier, GM's emergency war room. The executive floor carried a different weight when the crisis finally reached it. You could sense the shift from uncertainty to alarm as senior leaders gathered in a conference room that had not been used for emergency sessions in years. Internal memos circulated with increasing urgency, each one outlining risks more severe than the last. The tone sharpened when analysts presented the hard truth. The production surge had created an inventory wave so large that traditional correction methods would not contain it. Closing the gap required immediate, forceful action. A rapid response team came together, drawing in operations, finance, and regional leaders who rarely worked in the same room. Discussions ran long into the evening as competing priorities clashed. Some pushed to halt production entirely, while others warned that stopping the lines would trigger a cascade of contractual penalties throughout the supply chain. The most contentious debate centered on how aggressively to move the excess units. Leadership knew that pushing them into the retail network would transfer the burden onto dealerships, already strained by tightening margins. Yet the alternative, allowing the stockpile to grow, risked destabilizing quarterly forecasts and alarming investors. Large corporations react differently from small businesses. They act through layers of caution, calculation, and consequence. And in that room, the weight of every possible misstep pressed heavily against the walls. When the directive finally emerged, everything shifted for GM leadership. But while GM tried to contain the disaster from the inside, the real explosion was happening somewhere else entirely, at the dealerships. Dealers hit the breaking point. The breaking point did not arrive with a bang. It came slowly, almost silently, like water rising beneath the floorboards, until the dealership felt soaked in dread. I had managed stores through downturns before, but nothing compared to watching rows of vehicles sit motionless while the calendar kept turning. Each day added another layer of pressure, because every unit on the lot carried a cost that crept upward whether the engine ever started or not. Floor planning debt was once a manageable burden, something absorbed by steady sales. Now it ballooned into a monthly threat, compounded by interest rates that climbed without mercy. Conversations with the bank grew colder, more clinical, as if the institution was preparing to step away before the storm peaked. It felt like being trapped beneath a weight that refused to shift, no matter how many incentives we attempted or how many calls we made. The longer cars stayed apart, the more they drained the life from the business, turning once profitable models into liabilities. You cannot out-negotiate gravity. When cars stop moving, your whole business sinks. And for the first time, I sensed that the system we relied upon for decades no longer had our backs. Something deeper had broken, and the path forward was anything but clear. But just when dealers felt the pressure tightening, one store made a move that changed everything. The first $32,000 discount. I still remember the moment the call came through, carrying news that sounded more like a rumor than a strategy. A dealership in our region had slashed a sticker by $32,000. An act so bold and desperate that people thought the number was a misprint. At headquarters, the reaction was instant chaos. Phones lit up, emails poured in, and everyone demanded to know who authorized such a move. But the truth was simpler. No one had authorized anything. The dealer simply reached the edge of survival and decided that the only way out was to detonate the price floor. It reminded me of grocery stores dumping perishable goods before they spoil. Except this time, the product was not produce, but brand new vehicles that months earlier were considered premium inventory. Once the first cut hit the market, the reaction spread like shockwaves across the region. Buyers noticed, competitors panicked, and other stores began asking whether they, too, should break ranks. The phones in my office rang non-stop as managers pleaded for guidance, while also hinting that staying at full price might be suicide. I knew we had crossed a line that could not easily be redrawn. That dealership had not just discounted a vehicle, it had declared the market broken. But price cuts were only the start inside the showrooms. The human cost was about to erupt. The showroom staff revolt. The first signs of revolt among the showroom staff came not through shouting or confrontation, but through exhaustion. Salespeople who once thrived on energy and competition began arriving late, leaving early, or sitting silently at empty desks with no customers in sight. Commissions that used to pay mortgages and tuition shrank until they barely covered fuel. Financial managers who once processed loan applications all day now stared at vacant offices and wondered how long their positions would exist exist. Support staff felt the strain too, because every department depends on motion, and motion had vanished. As the discounts spread, employees believed the cuts might spark activity, but the opposite happened. Buyers sensed weakness and held out for even lower numbers, turning negotiations into marathons that drained morale further. A salesperson without a viable product is like a surgeon without instruments. The skill remains, but the purpose fades. Eventually, the tension became undeniable. Staff began openly questioning leadership, whispering about jumping to rival brands or submitting resignations they never imagined writing. The churn disrupted the rhythm of the dealership, fracturing the trust that once defined the culture. Loyalty became a luxury, and survival became the only focus. The collapse was no longer theoretical, it was human. And as the people on the front lines struggled, the largest dealer groups prepared to take their fight straight to GM. The dealer group, mutiny against GM. The tipping point for the dealer groups arrived when the largest consortium in our region gathered for what was supposed to be a routine strategy session. Instead, it became a mutiny. Executives from multiple stores sat around a long table, each one carrying the same grievances: aging inventory, plunging margins, shrinking credit lines, and a manufacturer that kept pushing more units despite the warning signs. Voices rose as frustration spilled into the open. The franchise agreement, once viewed as a mutually beneficial partnership, now felt like a chain around the ankle. Leaders argued that GM's internal decisions had created a crisis that dealers were being forced to absorb without support. The discussion shifted from anger to strategy when one group proposed a coordinated legal challenge, citing unfair pressure and contractual misalignment. Another group suggested withholding participation in manufacturer-driven programs until GM acknowledged the crisis openly. What unified everyone in the room was the sense that the incentives protecting the franchise system had fractured. When incentives misalign, franchise structures fail, and this moment felt like the beginning of such a collapse. The proposals grew bolder, the tone more combative, and by the end of the meeting, a coalition had formed with one purpose: force GM to face the consequences of its decisions. The mutiny had begun, and the fallout did not stop at the showroom doors. It began shaking the financial world next. Investors turn on GM from the vantage point of an institutional investor. The early warning signs were visible long before the public sensed anything wrong. Trading floors rely on patterns, and when a stock begins to break from its expected rhythm, analysts grow alert. That is exactly what happened as GM's filings hinted at swelling inventory and slowing movement. What began as a mild concern turned into palpable unease once the scale of the oversupply became impossible to ignore. Analysts issued cautious notes at first, then outright downgrades, citing weakening fundamentals and operational misalignment. The valuation models we depended on had to be rewritten because the assumptions propping them up no longer held. Investors do not react emotionally to bad news. They react to uncertainty, and this event created a void that no metric could fill. The lack of clarity around GM's long-term plan intensified the pressure, sending sell orders rippling across hedge funds and pension portfolios. Risk officers raised red flags, portfolio managers trimmed exposure, and traders watched the stock lose altitude day after day. In boardrooms and investment calls, the same question surfaced repeatedly. If the company could misread demand so drastically, what else might be structurally flawed? That question alone was enough to shake confidence across the financial sector and set the first domino in motion. But while investors recalibrated their positions, another part of the financial system was about to feel the strain far more directly. If you want the rest of this breakdown and every update as the fallout deepens, subscribe now. Banks confront a new auto loan problem. The alarm reached the banks through an entirely different channel: collateral values. As an auto lending risk officer, I am trained to monitor depreciation curves carefully, but what we saw unfold was unlike any historical trend. Vehicles that should have maintained predictable value began dropping faster than our models could adjust. The reason soon became clear. When dealerships slash prices to move stagnant inventory, the entire loan portfolio becomes exposed. Customers who purchased cars months earlier suddenly owe far more than the vehicles are worth, pushing loan-to-value ratios into dangerous territory. Once that imbalance deepens, repossession risk rises because financial stress and negative equity feed each other relentlessly. It is analogous to watching a financial asset sink in water, the weight pulling it downward while every attempt to lift it grows weaker. Our teams began running stress tests, simulating outcomes where used prices fell even further, and the results were sobering. Loss projections climbed sharply, and discussions shifted from routine oversight to crisis prevention. Banks tightened underwriting standards, raised credit score minimums, and debated whether to adjust interest rates upward to compensate for risk. This was not merely a banking issue, it was a systemic tremor radiating from GM's misstep. The auto loan market, long considered stable, had entered a period of volatility that would affect millions. And as the financial institutions tightened their grip, another market began to unravel beneath the surface: the used car market contagion. The used car market has always been sensitive to disruptions, but this time, the reaction resembled a contagion, spreading through every auction lane. As an analyst, working inside a major auction house, I could see the panic forming the moment consigners started flooding the schedule with vehicles they no longer wanted to hold. Inventory ballooned, bids thinned, and prices slid downward with alarming speed. Wholesalers, who once competed aggressively, began stepping back, fearful that catching a falling knife would destroy their margins. Rental fleets, already wrestling with outdated units, found themselves holding assets worth far less than projected. Each auction day became a visual lesson in supply overwhelming demand. Cars rolled across the block, but bidders hesitated, whispering about waiting another week because prices might drop even more. A market only works when someone is willing to catch the falling knife. Today, no one was. As values dropped, downstream effects multiplied. Leasing companies recalculated residuals. Dealers tried to reprice trade-ins without alienating customers, and insurers adjusted replacement values. The entire ecosystem felt a shock. This contagion did not simply reflect GM's crisis. It amplified it, creating a feedback loop where declining value further limited the ability to stabilize the market. Soon, the turbulence spread to the manufacturing sphere, where the deepest cuts would land. And when the turbulence reached the production network, the consequences became impossible for GM's partners to ignore. Supplier chain fallout. For Tier 1 suppliers, the warning did not come through headlines or investor calls. It came through abrupt order changes. As a component manufacturer, executive, I understood that fluctuations happen, but this wave of adjustments was different. GM reduced purchase volumes sharply, citing inventory saturation and the need to realign production. The impact was immediate. Plants that had been running steady shifts suddenly faced shortened schedules. Overtime evaporated. Temporary workers were dismissed. Managers scrambled to revise budgets that had assumed consistent output. Suppliers depend on predictability, and when the anchor company stumbles, the entire ecosystem is forced into contraction. Orders for parts that feed core models dried first, followed by cancellations on optional components. The cascade affected metal fabricators, electronics producers, plastics manufacturers, and even logistics partners who relied on steady freight movement. The somber realization settled in. This was not a short-term adjustment, but a structural correction with long-lasting implications. The strategies that once kept the supply chain resilient now seemed fragile under the weight of GM's inventory crisis. For companies like ours, the lesson became painfully clear. Dependence on a single automaker can turn from strength to vulnerability in a matter of weeks when signals are missed and communication falters. The fallout was no longer theoretical. It was operational and deeply felt. What will Washington do now? The question emerged almost immediately inside policy circles. How would Washington respond to a crisis that touched consumers, manufacturers, lenders, and labor simultaneously? From my position within the policy apparatus, I sensed how rapidly the tone shifted from curiosity to urgency. Economic crises always become political crises eventually, and this one was no exception. Lawmakers began calling for hearings to understand how a forecasting failure at one of the nation's most important automakers cascaded into market instability. Tariff debates resurfaced, as some argued that foreign competition had intensified the pressure on domestic brands, while others insisted the issue was entirely internal. Behind closed doors, conversations focused on whether intervention was necessary, either through loan guarantees for suppliers or incentives for production cuts that aligned output with real demand. Regulators examined dealer contracts, questioning whether franchise laws contributed to inventory stagnation. Agencies prepared briefing documents outlining potential scenarios, including consumer credit stress and regional labor disruptions. While public statements remained cautious, insiders recognized that Washington could not ignore a market shock tied to hundreds of thousands of unsold vehicles. The government's next move would shape how the entire industry prepared for recovery, and every stakeholder waited for the first official signal. But while Washington analyzed the crisis, foreign competitors saw an opportunity too valuable to ignore. How foreign competitors exploit the crisis. From the perspective of an international automaker strategist, GM's misstep opened a window that rarely appears in a mature industry. Competitors in China, Korea, and Europe wasted no time capitalizing on the moment. They recognized that when a dominant dominant player falters, consumers begin reassessing brand loyalty, and that reassessment can reshape market share for years. Chinese manufacturers, already aggressive in pricing and technology deployment, seized the narrative by presenting themselves as stable and forward-looking compared to an American giant struggling to manage its inventory. Korean brands pushed promotional campaigns, emphasizing reliability and efficiency, while European manufacturers leaned on premium positioning to attract buyers unsettled by GM's market volatility. In strategy calls, we often say competitors do not wait for you to recover, they take your lunch. This crisis embodied that truth. Foreign automakers adjusted shipment schedules, expanded marketing budgets, and fast-tracked dealership incentives to draw customers away from domestic brands. Their goal was not merely short-term sales, but structural advantage. A weakened GM meant more negotiating power with suppliers, greater leverage in international markets, and a chance to redefine buyer expectations. The global chessboard had shifted, and every major automaker moved swiftly to occupy the space GM had left vulnerable. And while foreign brands advanced, another force at home began preparing its own response: labor. How labor plans to fight back. Labor leaders did not need lengthy reports to understand the reality unfolding beneath the headlines. They heard it through worker conversations, shift reductions, and mounting uncertainty on factory floors. As union leadership, I felt the mood transition from frustration to determination. Workers feared that GM's inventory disaster would become an excuse for job cuts or weakened contract terms. To them, the crisis represented more than mismanagement. It echoed industrial-era moments when corporate mistakes became labor's burden. Modern labor movements draw strength from historical battles, and the parallels were impossible to ignore. Strategists debated coordinated actions, including demands for job security clauses, protections against involuntary furloughs, and enhanced retraining programs for displaced workers. Strike threats entered the discussions, not as reckless gestures, but as tools to ensure management understood the seriousness of the moment. Meetings with policymakers highlighted the human cost of market volatility, urging Washington to consider worker-first strategies. The union's focus was not only defensive, it was proactive, emphasizing that an industry cannot stabilize without the people who build its products. This fight was not merely about wages or hours, it was about safeguarding dignity in an economy where automation, competition, and corporate missteps increasingly threaten the workforce. Yet, even as labor sought protection, the broader question lingered. What would this crisis mean for the future of car buying itself? What this means for the future of car buying? The future of car buying was already evolving, but the crisis accelerated every emerging trend. From an industry futurist's perspective, GM's inventory collapse exposed the weaknesses of a system built on mass production and mass distribution. Consumers, increasingly accustomed to customization and digital purchasing, began questioning why automakers still relied on giant lots filled with vehicles no one asked for. Direct sales models, once considered disruptive curiosities, now appeared efficient and logical. Subscription services, once niche, now appeal to buyers seeking flexibility over ownership. Build-to-order models gained momentum as a precise alternative to flawed forecasts, signaling a philosophical shift away from the traditional dealership system. Technology will drive this evolution through data-guided production, offering shoppers transparency and personalization while forcing automakers toward strategic reinvention. Mobility will change permanently, and this crisis marks the spark of the industry's next major battle. This situation is still unfolding, and what happens next could reshape prices, trade-ins, and the entire auto market. I want to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this breakdown helped you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update, because this story isn't over yet.